if you click this video right now, you're probably suffering. And I want you to listen to this one fundamental thing. Free your suffering from the burden to get rid of it. You need to liberate your suffering, and the only way you can do that is from relieving yourself of the need to get rid of it. If you continue to suffer and then you continue to try and get rid of it, you're adding more suffering to what is already suffering. So the only way that you're really going to end this process is if you stop trying to get rid of your suffering. Your suffering doesn't need to go. Your suffering will go on its own. Your suffering is made of resistance. Your suffering is made of the sheer fact that you want to remove what is happening in your experience. So tell me, how would you ever be able to remove your suffering by wanting to remove your suffering? You would just be perpetuating the very thing that it is made of. So how I actually understood how to end my suffering was understanding that essentially suffering is not a problem. The suffering isn't a problem. Suffering was always the gateway to recognize and to point me towards my true nature. I then made it my one desire to stop worrying about my suffering and to just be interested in what is the truth of my experience. Like, what is the truth? What is the truth? I've been suffering my entire life. It just seems like a fucking shit show. Why don't I just seek the one thing that I've never ever wanted to know, which is to actually understand the truth? And when we do this, we completely purify the desire. And what we seem to do then is suffering begins to become less of a problem. And when your suffering isn't a problem, you're not really suffering. You see, and this is the main thing, the main point to get across here. If your suffering isn't a problem, then you're not really suffering. It's only a problem when you add this extra layer of suffering, which is the need to remove your suffering. This is where most people get caught out in the spiritual path, and this is where most people just get caught out in life. Because then what they do is they start to seek the truth in order to get rid of their suffering. We have to come to a stage where suffering isn't, we don't attempt to remove suffering. We just attempt to actually see what the suffering is made of. What does it consist of? What is it that's actually making me uncomfortable about my suffering? Is it the suffering itself? Well, let's check out what is in the suffering that is making me uncomfortable. And what you'll find is that you'll start, instead of trying to get rid of the suffering, you'll start investigating the suffering. You'll start looking at the suffering and going, okay, this thing that has been there my entire life, I'm finally turning around to face it and actually look at what I'm finding uncomfortable about it. The minute you go there, it's like looking at those dots that you get in your eyes and you try to look at them and then they bounce away, you know, like when you stand up too quick or something. It's extremely important that we have this recognition that we don't need to get rid of our suffering. I know it's fucking crazy, but we don't. We don't need to get rid of our suffering. So if you're watching this right now and you feel like you've been trying so hard to do everything you can to seek the truth in order to get rid of this damaging suffering, then let this be the last thing that you need to hear to stop trying to get rid of your suffering. It isn't a problem. The only problem is when you're trying to get rid of it. The suffering you had, yes, it was a problem at the time, but now you're at a stage where you don't need to abide to that same principle. You don't need to abide to the same principle, which is, in order to defend myself from the dangers of life, I will resist my experience because I know no other option. That was a legitimate path before we knew how to actually process emotions. So now at this stage, we can stop trying to remove this suffering and allow ourselves the freedom to suffer. So this would be the final message, is to allow yourself the freedom to suffer. Just give yourself that freedom. Give yourself the freedom to suffer as much as you need to suffer. And when you give yourself that freedom, if you take that all the way, see what is left of your suffering. If you want guidance on this process, I have a free community where you can learn this complete letting go, which I call the ultimate forgiveness. And it's not the forgiveness of a wrongdoing, it's pure ultimate acceptance. And click the link in the description and you will get access